Eager to hear from you, Commissioner. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anita. We are in a serious situation when it comes to security threat. This started with the unprovoked, unjustified invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And now we have seen also that this has been followed by mass graves that have been explored. We have seen people that have signs of torture that have been found dead. We have now recently seen attacks at the pipelines of Nord Stream. Of course, still investigations has to be done before we know more about this. And recently, Putin has mobilized Russian citizens and also now doing an illegal annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions. This makes the situation very serious for us. There is an escalation of the security threat. That's why we are now presenting new guidelines on visa procedures and border controls. We have already totally suspended the visa facilitation between Russia and the EU. We have already presented guidelines that are quite restrictive for the issuing of visas for Russian citizens. Today, the Commission is also adopting further guidelines that will even further focusing on the security threat and how to deal with the security threat towards us. So what are we presenting in the new guidelines? We say we have a stricter assessment and a more thorough security assessment when it comes to new visas. Member states need to do a very thorough security assessment, and if a person could be a security threat or be a threat towards the international relation for some of the member states, this person should not be issued a visa. We also say that we have a lot of Russian citizens that are now leaving Russia because of the mobilization. If a person, a Russian citizen, intends to stay longer than 90 days in the EU, he or she should not be issued a visa. We call on member states to very thoroughly investigate whether there is a risk of a person that will be issued a short-term visa that will not leave back to Russia in time of the 90 days where the visa is valid to. Having said this, of course, we always have the right for such individuals that seek international protection under the EU asylum acquis. Is always what I say now does not affect in any aspect the right to apply for asylum. It's also that every citizen can apply if intending to leave Russia for a long term, to apply for a long stay visas or a residence permit. But what I'm saying now is about the short-term visas, the so-called Schengen visas. We also say that we need a much stricter approach when it comes to the place of visa application. A lot of Russian citizens have now left Russia to neighboring countries, where they might go to consulates of the EU member states to apply for visas. In the guidelines, we say that member states should not accept Schengen visa applications from citizens of the Russian Federation that are present in a third country. They have to do that from their home country, Russia. Of course, there are also here exceptions if there are people with humanitarian reasons or family reasons or journalists, for example, that still has this possibility. So we will not have any restrictions for those that come like dissidents and independent journalists and for these kind of reasons. But when it comes to citizens, Russian citizens that just want to come to the EU because they don't want to stay in Russia anymore, this stricter approach has to be applied. We also say that a member state need to revoke or reassess already valid visas in the context of this new security situation. We also say on guidelines to the border guards that, of course, just having a valid visa is not enough, is not sufficient to be able to be let into the EU. The border guards also need to carry out other security checks in this specific situation with this escalation of the security threat towards the European Union. I'm very aware also that Russia has been talking frequently on using also nuclear weapons. And today, President Putin will announce the illegal annexation of the 4 Ukrainian regions. This is clearly an escalation of the conflict, an escalation of the war, and that means also an escalation of the security threat towards the European Union, and we need to act to that, and we need to follow this very closely. The Commission will follow up on this and monitor together with the Member States in this blueprint network that we have, and also discuss further actions together with the Member States in the IPCR format. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We will take your questions. First, we will start with questions from the press room. Mose, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anita. I don't know if we can take the opportunity to ask questions in Swedish. I don't know. No, otherwise, okay, I'll continue in English. As we know, those EU member states which border to Russia have been very reluctant to receive any more Russian citizens applying for visa, for short-term visa. So it seems to be a divide in the EU on this issue. Would you say that this comes into expression in these new guidelines? And when it comes to the question about people fleeing now Russia because they refuse to serve in the Russian army and risk thereby to commit war crimes in Ukraine, or if they refuse at all to serve, they risk year-long imprisonment. As far as I understand, there is a ruling by the European Court of Justice from 2020 that this could, let's say, refuse the military service because of political reasons could be an, let's say, a legitimate reason for granting asylum. So did you at all, consider, instead of, let's say, make it more difficult and stricter, this asylum, let's say, control, the scrutiny, to include among the categories of people who can, let's say, be considered for short-term visas, such as journalists, you said that, or human rights defenders and so on, also people who flee Russia now because they refuse to be conscripted forcibly. Thank you.
Commissioner. Yes, thank you. First, I do not see a big division between member states. We have been tasked by the member states to issue these new guidelines, and that's why we come with them now. And of course, there is a special situation for the countries that are bordering Russia, and I really fully understand the reason in the security situation to have a much stricter approach, and this is also supported by the guidelines that we are now presenting. When it comes to the right to apply for asylum and how these individual asylum requests are being assessed, this is not touched upon at all in these guidelines. To apply for asylum is a fundamental right, and each person that applies for asylum has the right to a fair process to have his or her case examined by the national authorities. That could lead to asylum if you are fleeing from taking part in the war, but that is an individual assessment. This is not what this guidelines is about. These guidelines is about issuing short-term visas for Russian citizens. And then we say that just because you do not want to go to Ukraine and fight is not the same as you could not be a security threat towards the European Union. It's also, as it is for all other citizens, you have to make sure that will only stay for the 90 days that a visa is valid for. If you intend to stay for longer, you should not be issued a short-term visa. Then instead you can apply for a long-term visa or a residence permit if you are intending to leave your country for a longer period, and that is a national competence to issue these kind of visa. So I would say that it's important not to mix up the right to have a tourist visa or short-term visa into the EU is not a fundamental right, it's a privilege. The right to apply for asylum is a fundamental right.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have further hands up. We'll start with Richard. Richard? You need to press speak.
Yeah. Do you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Probably don't see me, but hear me. Okay. I have a sort of hypothetical question for the Commissioner. So if there is a Russian citizen who has a visa, humanitarian or otherwise, and he or she can obviously not fly into the EU now. Let's say that he or she got the visa from, let's say, Germany, and wants to go to Germany. It's issued by Germany. He probably has to cross over via Finland or Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. Does this person, or does these countries bordering Russia, still have the right to deny this person entry? Or do they have to sort of create some sort of green lanes into Western EU member states that have issued the visa? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Thank you. This is clear in the Schengen's border code that to have a valid visa is not sufficient to be granted access into the EU or Schengen territory. The border guards also have to make their own assessments, and in the light of the security threats that we see now, and also the very cumbersome, I should say, process to investigate whether an individual could pose such a threat towards internal security or towards any member state's relation to third country, that could be the reason to deny that person entry. So having a visa is not sufficient to have the access into the EU.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Aida is next.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I had a follow-up on the last question. So could you be very specific if it means that, for example, the Netherlands or Germany in this case gives asylum to a Russian, no matter who he is, he gets asylum, this person still can be stopped at the border? Yes or no? Because it's not quite clear what happens to people who are granted asylum. Thank you.
Commissioner.
And have been granted asylum, of course, you have the access to come into that country that have given you that, granted that asylum to you. What I'm talking about now, and the guidelines we are presenting, do not affect, it's not about asylum. It's only about visas and border checks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maria?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much. Maria Odrescu for La Libre Belgique. It's a follow-up because it's not about asylum, but it's linked, because what I do not still understand is basically how and where can a Russian citizen today apply for asylum to come to an EU member state, because I mean there's still quite a big of confusion around this. I mean, you have to be on the territory of the EU most of the time to be able to apply for asylum. So I'm just wondering, given the situation today, as you said, Russians might be granted asylum if they flee mobilization and being sent to Ukraine, but how do they access to this fundamental right? Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Commissioner?
Yes, Maria, what you say is correct. And what I'm presenting now is that we are using the same approach towards Russian citizens that we have towards all other citizens that want to come to the EU and apply for asylum. You have to apply, if you are coming from a country where it's necessary with a visa, you have to apply for a visa. If the issuing country think that you will not leave in the 90 days, you are instead using that for staying for a longer time, then you will be denied that visa. And what I'm saying now is that we will not have any other regulation for the Russian citizens than we have for others. So this is the same. And I think this really goes with the situation of the escalated security threat towards us, where we need to go very much thoroughly through each individual before granting any visas. That's why we also need to prioritize, and this is not the time to give an easier access for Russian citizens than for other citizens that also might want to apply for asylum in the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have a first question by the colleague here. Please present yourself.
Thank you very much. Rosie Burchard for Feature Story News. Commissioner, do you have any updates on how many Russians have entered the European Union since the announcement of this partial military mobilisation? And has there been any indication from member states to the Commission that there's a threat from Russians that have entered since this mobilisation announcement? You obviously mentioned the bigger picture, so the nuclear threats, the annexation and so on, which suggest a bigger security threat. But has there been any internal security threat flagged to you so far? Thank you very much.
Commissioner?
So, I think I have the figures from 2 days ago, I think. Then there was around 10 to 20,000 more entries of Russians into the EU than normal in September. So that means entering of 190,000 maybe in relation to 170,000 in a normal. In August we had an entry of 300,000 because it was a holiday month. So there is always a lot of cross-border on the EU and Russia. So the numbers of people that have entered more than usual right now is not that high to the EU, but on the other hand we are seeing a lot of people leaving the Russian Federation to neighboring countries, and these people might want to also come to the European Union or try to come to the European Union later on. We have so far seen very few applications for asylum of Russian citizens. I think we have the last week had around like 20 or 30 applications per day, so it's not a big one. When it comes to the threat, we have heard Russian representatives talking about going to EU member states and using the same language as they used when they poisoning the Skripal, Julia Skripal, you remember, that was poisoned, and this has been the same kind of language has been used for going back to EU member states and do the same. We have also seen Russian citizens that have come on tourist visas with the aim to provoke Ukrainian refugees and to make propaganda for Putin. So there have been cases, but I think the overall situation is that the security threat overall is much, much more serious. That means that we have to do much more thorough security assessments for each individual that we let in to the EU from Russia.
Oh, I see several hands up, Moses, so we need to take those into account that have not asked already. Alice.
Hello?
Yes?
Hello?
Can you speak up and present yourself?
Yes, Alice Tidy for Euronews. I just want clarification on what the Commissioner said. So if I'm a Russian citizen and I've managed to make my way to Georgia and I want to come to the EU, I can go to the consulate of a member state and that member state can decide to issue me a visa, but they're not allowed to issue a Schengen visa. Is that correct?
Commissioner?
Sorry. It's partly correct. Our recommendation is that the normal situation is, and that's already in the regulation, that you should apply in your country of origin and not in a third country. And our guidelines say that we should be very restrictive on issuing visas in consulates in third countries. We also say, apply for this, that if there is any doubt that this person will not leave the EU in the scope of the 90 days for a Schengen visa, then the Schengen visa should not be issued. And that is already in the regulation, and this has been applied to all other citizens. Still is the possibility for a person that is fleeing Russia and don't want to go back to Russia in 90 days to apply for a long-term visa or on maybe on humanitarian grounds and or a residence permit in a member state, and that they can do on the consulate for that member state in a third country.
Thank you. Carl, you're next. Can you press speak, please, and present yourself?
Yes, sorry. Carl de Meyer for the French daily Les Echos. I would like to know, Madam Commissioner, what happens between the moment a Russian citizen applies for asylum in one of the in the EU and the moment the decision comes. I suppose it takes time. So what are these Russian citizens supposed to do while they are waiting for an answer? And second question, you said that member states must be vigilant and ensure that Russian citizens who have a short-term visa do not stay longer than 90 days in the EU. But how can you ensure that? How can you enforce this measure? Thank you.
Commissioner?
Yes, first, what is clear in the guidelines is that member states should make prioritize on the visa applications, and that we already issued in the earlier guidelines. So they should prioritize urgent needs. For example, if there's a dissident, if there's a person that need to go, there's an independent journalist, if they're for urgent family reasons, then you should prioritize these visa application and deal with them as soon as possible. That means also that those that do not have urgent reason, that apply for tourist visas, they should be deprioritized. And what we actually put on additional now is that we should be very, very restrictive on issuing these kind of tourist visas in this situation with the security threat that we are in. Mm-hmm. But there's a second question as well, and then I forgot it.
Carl, can you repeat the second question?
Yes. Yes. So, and how can the member states be sure that the people who enter with a 90 days visa will not stay longer? How do you enforce that measure?
Commissioner?
citizens and not to Russians before, because we had a visa facilitation agreement, but this is totally suspended now. And that means, and this is what member states, consulates and embassies are doing all the time, they have to assess if there are doubts whether this person is not actually a tourist that will only go for the 90 days, or if this is a person that will pretend or try to stay for longer, then there's clear in the visa code that member states should not issue visas when there are doubts. And this they have been applying for most of the people around the globe that apply for visas to the EU. Has not been for Russians because we had a visa facilitation agreement, but now we have suspended the visa facilitation agreement, and we stress in the guidelines that this is important.
Thank you. Mattia, you're next. Press speak, please, and introduce yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yes, this is Mattia Bagnoli, ANSA, the National Italian News Agency. Commissioner, I have a question about the long-term visas for Russians that have been issued by European member states. We know that up to 90 days is one thing, but there are many visas issued to Russians which are way longer than that, up to 3 years, some of them even 5 years. Now, you said that the recommendation now is to reassess and possibly revoke some of the visas issued. So I would like to ask you if you are encouraging the member state to revoke as a blanket measure those longer than 90 days visa. Secondly, if you are not doing that as a blanket measure, but case by case, if you are encouraging the member state to review those longer visas case by case, and what happens if those Russians that hold those kind of visas are already in the EU, can they be deported? Thank you.
Thank you, Mattia. Commissioner?
I think it's a good idea for member states to reassess the long-term visas, but I'm very aware that the long-term visas is a national competence and not an EU competence. So it's a national competence to issue them, and it's also the national competence to say whether they need to be reassessed or not. But I should say that it's a very good idea, and there is also something that we will also follow up in, but that is not in the competence for the Commission to give guidance on.
Thank you very much. We have Samuel, Shona, and then we'll do some follow-ups. Samuel? Press speak and present yourself, please.
Scripts would try to enter the EU to escape mobilization. I'm wondering if this is something that has really materialized, and if it's the case, can you tell us about precise numbers? How many of them have fled the war and entered the EU? Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner?
We don't have any exact numbers of those that have been entering the EU in the last week. What member states like Finland tell us is a lot of men in the age that are for the mobilization that have entered into the EU. The numbers are still not very high, but there have been a shift in the combination of individuals that entered into the EU. We have seen very few that have applied for asylum. So that means that we don't really know exactly the reason, but you can guess that have been, and it seems like a lot of those 10 to 20,000 extra Russians that have been entering, but the figures could change, of course. Don't have the exact figures right now. That a majority of those have left because of the mobilization, but we don't have any exact figures or reasons for people to leave.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Shona.
Euronews. I just wanted to ask you, Commissioner, about the point you were making that you're hearing Russians talking about going to the EU and doing the same as they did in Salisbury against the Skripals. Could you just elaborate on what you are hearing about that? You're saying that they're using the same sort of language. Just what intelligence do you have? Thank you so much.
Commissioner?
No, I don't have any intelligence. I listened to the vocal of this. Sorry, I don't have the name right now of one of those frequent in the. Maybe somebody can help me with the name. A woman. For one spokesperson for one of those Russian media. That said, after the attack of the daughter of one high-level official, that she was killed in a car bombing, car explosion. And then they said that they might go to Tallinn to look at nice views of Tallinn, which was exactly the same kind of language they used on the killing of Skripal.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then we go back to Maria, and then.
Thank you. Just a technical question to understand what the European and international law says. So, if a person presents itself at the borders of the EU and clearly expresses the intention to apply for asylum, does that member state have the obligation to let that person in order for so that he can apply for asylum? Thanks.
Commissioner?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Clear answer. Mose, you're next.
Yes, thank you very much, Anita. I would like to come back to a follow-up question to what the Commissioner said. If I understand you correctly, you said that if there is a risk that someone applying for short-term visa will overstay his or her stay more than 3 months, then that visa should not be granted by any member state. But does this not effectively mean that Russian men who want to apply, they say, for visa because they don't want to serve in the Russian army, that they will not be granted any visa or asylum because it's obvious they won't be able to return to Russia as long as the war continues. It will continue. We don't see an end in sight of it yet.
Commissioner?
Yes, and then they should not apply for a short-term visa because short-term visas is only for those staying for a short term in the Schengen area. Otherwise, they need to apply for a residence permit or a long-term visa.
Very clear. I see 3 hands up still. Maria is still for you. That was cleared. Samuel.
My hand raised.
Shona, is your hand still up? Is it still relevant? Press speak, please. No, it's cleared. I see no further questions. I would like to thank you, Commissioner, for these detailed explanations and wish you a good afternoon. I see we have Carl, we take a last question. Okay.
Yes, Madam Commissioner, just sorry, it's a question about another subject. Do you have more information about the suspicious powder that has been found in the Berlaymont on the 13th floor?
Carl, I'm sorry, this is not the place for these questions. We will end now the press conference. Thank you very much, and we remain available for any follow-ups. Good afternoon.